to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion now of the period between the American Revolution and the writing of the Constitution. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about the Confederation Government, which ruled in the states after the American Revolution leading up to the Constitution. And we're going to talk a little bit about why the Articles of Confederation ultimately proved insufficient for governing our nation. In the previous lecture, we talked about the idea of civic virtue and the thought that in order for a nation to be successful, its citizens really had to subsume their individual interest to the betterment of the public good. Well, those kind of ideas led to extensions of democracy in the aftermath of the Revolution to places that we had not seen previously. And I talked a little bit about this at the end of our discussion of the Revolution itself and some of the outcomes of the Revolution. But after just fighting a war to overthrow a monarchy and an imperial controlling government, it really would not do to reestablish a similar kind of government in these new budding United States. And so that meant that in the aftermath of the Revolution, we saw an extension of democracy to what was sometimes referred to as the middling sort. And we might describe the man in the picture here as representing the middling sort. He is employed, he's reasonably well off, he's got a nice outfit there, and he's making his own way. But he's clearly not part of the sort of landed gentry or elite with vast tracts of land, etc. And we're going to see in a number of states democracy being extended to this middling sort, and more people, in fact, even holding office during this time. Now, one of the other issues that's going to kind of shed some light on the weaknesses of the Confederation government are economic issues. And actually, this middling sort would have been ensnared by some of these kinds of issues because there was a tremendous amount of debt in the aftermath of the American Revolution, particularly from farmers in the countryside who had grown their crops and in part tried to feed the revolutionary armies, and yet now in the aftermath they were being called to pay off their debts. Now there were a number of efforts to kind of ease that burden. Stay laws, in some cases, allowed farmers to postpone payment of their debts until such time as they were able to do it. In some states, there were tender laws that allowed farmers to pay off their debts with goods rather than with money. And the other approach to this that became widespread throughout the states was just the extension of paper currency and printing more and more money. Now, when done in the extreme, this can lead to dangerous inflation and money can become essentially worthless. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later on. But when done carefully and sort of monitored, you can help people ease a situation when they're in debt by essentially making their debt cost less. If the value of an individual dollar decreases, then you can pay off debts more easily. So we're going to be talking about all of these things, and some of these economic issues really come to a head and just demonstrate how the Confederation government was insufficient at that time. So as we think about our ultimate kind of end point in this conversation will be the writing of the Constitution and the establishment of the new nation. Well, how do we get from the end of the Revolution to that point? Well, one of the things we need to talk about is the Confederation Government, which was overseen by the Articles of Confederation, written in 1777 and ratified in 1781. And essentially, we're going to realize that these Articles of Confederation are not adequate for governing the nation, and they're going to need to be replaced. Um, but they did do some important things, one of which was to establish a union of the colonies actually during the Revolution, but in the aftermath of the Revolution as well. So, what kind of things did Congress under the Confederation have the power to do? Well, Congress could wage war, and of course, we're in the midst of the Revolution when the Confederation government was established. And that was one of the main purposes of it. It could regulate foreign affairs. It could mediate boundary disputes between the states. Could administrate Indian affairs, run the post office, and some other things as well. But it also lacked some vital powers. It could not raise troops. So while you're asking it to wage war and sort of defend the colonies, it does not have the authority to raise troops. It relied on troops raised within the individual states. It could not levy taxes. And this is going to be a huge weakness as we go forward. So again, it sort of relied on voluntary contributions from the states. And also, all acts had to be unanimous in order to go into effect. And that proved to be very difficult to get things done. And we're going to talk a little bit later about the various disputes and differences between large states and small states, slave states and free states, and so on. It was very hard to get all of the states to agree on anything unanimously. So it's very hard for the Confederation government to get things done. Now, the Articles of Confederation are going to prove woefully inadequate to govern the states as we move forward. But I do want to point out that they did, in many ways, accomplish their initial purpose, and they did do some important things before ultimately they were overturned by the writing of the Constitution. Remember that they were intended to address a dire national emergency. In 1777, when the Articles were drawn up, George Washington and the Continental Army were in dire straits and appeared on the verge of defeat. These were perilous times, and the Articles managed to get us through that emergency. The Articles also did establish a number of important ideas and precedents. If we look at some of the Articles, I'm just going to point out a few of the things that they do that, for the most part, are actually preserved as we work towards the Constitution. Just the idea of establishing one nation among the states, bringing the states together. Article 1 in the Articles of Confederation used the phrase, these states shall be the United States of America. Article 5 guaranteed members of Congress the right to speak their opinions and not be punished. This article read, "Freedom of speech and debate in Congress shall not be impeached or questioned in any court or place out of Congress." So clearly that's an important idea, that if you're speaking your opinions and you can be arrested or beaten or thrown out, that's not going to work. Article 4 established the idea of national citizenship, which essentially overruled individual state citizenship. So the free inhabitants of each of these states, paupers, vagabonds, and fugitives from justice excepted, shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of free citizens in the several states. So if you're a citizen of a state, you're a citizen of all of the states. Article 9 also signified the unity of the colonies. It read in part, "The United States in Congress assembled shall also be the last resort on appeal in all disputes and differences in terms of boundaries and other things like that." So can you imagine individual states going to war against each other over boundary disputes? So this is an important idea. Now finally, I would point out in Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation another idea which ultimately is going to cause grievous pain and difficulty to our nation is established, the idea of states' rights. So Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation read, "Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated to the United States." So obviously states' rights is going to be a major issue going forward, and particularly as we approach the Civil War. So the Articles did some important things, but as I've said, they were plagued by crippling weaknesses. So what were some of the problems with the Articles of Confederation? Well, they called for only a single house in the legislature, with each state getting one vote. And as I mentioned, it required a unanimous decision. There were no separate branches for the judicial branch. So each state had to abide by the judicial decisions of the other states, and that got to be very problematic and confusing. The Congress could not impose taxes, as I mentioned above. And so there are all kinds of difficulties with this. You see some of them represented in the cartoon there to the right. We can kind of see the issue that comes up here in terms of paying for the expenses of the Revolutionary War, which were referenced in Article 8. This article read in part, "All charges of the war and all other expenses incurred for the common defense or general welfare, shall be defrayed out of a common treasury, which shall be supplied by the several states in proportion to the value of all land within each state." And yet they don't have the power to tax. There really isn't power to enforce that, so the states could ultimately decide how much they wanted to contribute themselves. So eventually we're going to see these weaknesses and flaws in the Articles are going to require revision and change by the time of the Constitution. So what kind of things are happening in those years, 1783 to 1789, kind of compelling us to make changes? Well, first of all, the Confederation government was always kind of viewed as an experimental government. I don't think anyone, even those who drew it up, expected that it would survive forever. And so they're willing to entertain the idea of revising it, changing it, and as it turns out, ultimately just doing away with it. There was also fear of a powerful central government. Again, this is the idea of not wanting to replace one monarch or king with another, but they're starting to realize that they need a stronger central government than the one they had. So nobody wants to recreate the monarchy, but they're going to need to strengthen the government itself. And finally, there's just necessity arising during this time. This weak government is confronting threats from the British, from the outside. They're confronting threats from the Spanish along the Mississippi River. And they're confronting threats from within, disgruntled citizens, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. By the late 1780s, the situation is getting desperate. The government is bankrupt. They have no funds with which to manage the national defense and other issues. They're not able to tax and raise money, and the states themselves are not really contributing. And there are all kinds of money disputes going on throughout the various states. The continental money which is being issued at this time, I described the idea of inflation. It's becoming worth less and less. And so there are really kind of dire issues confronting the government as we head into the late 1780s. Now, there were a number of episodes that flared up in the late 1780s that demonstrated the Confederation government was not sufficient. But I want to talk very briefly about one, which was Shays Rebellion. In 1787, Daniel Shays led an uprising of about 4,000 men in Massachusetts, protesting the state's efforts to collect taxes. The federal government, it turned out, was essentially helpless to intervene, and so this rebellion raged for a time before it was ultimately put down by Massachusetts troops and a local militia, but not before demonstrating just how weak the Confederation government was. And Thomas Jefferson was not deeply troubled by this. It was in the aftermath of Shays' Rebellion that he uttered his famous words, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." But many others in the states took this episode as deeply symbolic of the need to replace the Articles of Confederation with something better.